The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll begin in the next couple of minutes. Thanks very much. All right, it is officially 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get the webinar started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Avalon Bristow, Program Director at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, MARCO, and co-coordinator of MACAN. Today, we are excited to have Sarah Nuss, Education Coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia, and Greta Olsen, a NOAA Hollings Scholar with the Mid-Atlantic NERRs, share updates on a new coastal acidification module under development for K-12 teachers in the Mid-Atlantic. But before we get to that, I just wanted to give you all a quick look at our upcoming webinar series. In addition to today, we have 2 other webinars planned for this year so far. Our March 23rd webinar will highlight research from 5 Mid-Atlantic Sea Grant OA fellows who recently completed their fellowships. We'll be sending out a registration link for that shortly. Our next webinar, to be held in May, will highlight a diversity of career paths for students keen to study ocean or coastal acidification. And with that, I'd like to kick it over to Kirsten Wakefield, our outreach coordinator for MACAN. Kirsten, it's all you.
Thanks, Avalon. I just wanted to give a little background about today's webinar topic. In 2020, MACAN convened an outreach working group where I serve as the interim chair to help develop Mid-Atlantic focused materials for a variety of stakeholders. Our membership includes Sea Grant and Marine Advisory Program Specialists, NERRs educators and scientists, state agency representatives, and local aquaria. One of the priorities we identified in our discussion was to create an ocean and coastal acidification toolbox for K-12 teachers and informal educators. An initial needs assessment found few resources focused specifically on local drivers of acidification and impacts to Mid-Atlantic habitats and species. So our partners in the Mid-Atlantic NERRs programs offered to dive in and fill this need with an education module through the Teachers on the Estuary workshops that they conduct every summer. Then Sarah Nuss and Greta Olsen will introduce you to this exciting new resource underway. But before we jump in, we'd like to just take a quick poll to find out who is in our audience today and hear what your connection is to coastal acidification, whether you're an educator, a decision maker, a scientist. So Liza, if we can open up the poll for everybody. And then following the presentation, we'll have about 20 minutes for any questions and comments. You can ask your questions via the question box at any time during the webinar or by raising your hand during the Q&A session. Sarah and Greta are looking forward to hearing your suggestions as they continue to develop the coastal acidification module. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MACAN website on the resources page with our previous webinar series. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah and Greta.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to just pull up my slides. Maybe. Can you all see my screen, my slide there? Greta? Okay, great. Thank you all for joining today. We're excited to share the work that we've been working on with MACAN. And I see lots of familiar faces or names in the attendees. So I know some of you already know this, but for those of you that are not as familiar, I just wanted to give a little bit of background before Greta gets into the specifics of our project about NERR. So I'm the education coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia, and you can see on this map there are 30 coastal sites in our NERR system that are designated to protect and study estuarine systems. We were established through the Coastal Zone Management Act, and we represent a partnership between NOAA and the coastal states. NOAA provides funding and guidance for us, and each site is managed on a daily basis by a lead state agency. In our case, the College of William and Mary and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science is our state partner. Within each reserve, there are 4 sectors: research, stewardship, education, and training. And so I work in the education sector, and each reserve has an education coordinator. And so in our MACAN group, we had 3 of the Mid-Atlantic education coordinators that were represented in the work group. And so when we were shown these priorities that Kirsten was just talking about, we saw a clear fit with the work that we're doing within the reserve system, and specifically with our teacher professional development program, which is called the Teachers on the Estuary. So we saw a clear fit for new and authentic resources, especially data resources to share with teachers that attend our annual Tote Workshops. These are some images from Tote Workshops around the United States. Each reserve has conducted a needs assessment of teachers in their area to determine what data, what online resources, what classroom activities, what professional development they need. And several of the requests, at least in Virginia, would be met by a MACAN coastal acidification module. So myself, the Jacques Cousteau NERR in New Jersey, and the Delaware NERR joined forces to access several Tote Workshops in the summer of 2021. And therefore, we had a great subsample of teachers in the Mid-Atlantic to run ideas by. And we also had 2 amazing summer interns across our reserves that led the charge for this project, one of which is not here today, Bethany Klein, who worked with the Delaware NERR, and Greta Olsen, who is here today, who spent the summer with us and is really going to explain the main parts of this project. So I will turn it over to Greta.
Thanks, Sarah. So just a little background on me and why I'm involved with this project. So I was a NOAA Hollings Scholar, which it's a 10-week or a 2-year program for juniors and seniors in college that are interested in oceanic and atmospheric sciences. And it comes with a 10-week research opportunity at a NOAA facility. And so I was at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuary Research Reserve in Virginia. I worked with Sarah and actually worked as an education intern, which was a little bit out of my wheelhouse because I'm studying chemical engineering. I'll be graduating this May, and I'm a senior at the University of Kansas. So I was not familiar with the Mid-Atlantic region or coastal acidification before starting this project, but that kind of was a good thing because that seemed like a lot of the teachers were also not super familiar with the term. So I was kind of on the same level as them going into it. So today I'll be talking to you about my involvement with the Coastal Acidification Teaching Guide with MACAN. Like Sarah and Kirsten discussed, MACAN wanted to create the coastal acidification module for educators that was particularly relevant to the Mid-Atlantic region. So I worked with another intern at the Delaware NERR site to organize the module, and then we were supervised by Kirsten and then the education coordinators from the 3 NERR sites that Sarah mentioned. We found that many of the lessons and activities related to ocean, there are many of lessons related to ocean and coastal acidification, but really none were related specifically to the Mid-Atlantic region. And since coastal acidification is a really local issue and there's different drivers in different coastal areas, it seemed really important to get those Mid-Atlantic regional resources. There's a lot focused on the West Coast or ocean acidification on the whole, but not so much in the Mid-Atlantic region. We also found that the term coastal acidification was relatively new, and there wasn't much clear differentiation between the term ocean and coastal acidification. So we wanted to be really clear in the differences and similarities between those two while working on this module. We also worked to organize the resources into the module, and we geared it towards secondary students just to start with, because there is a lot of information and there's some complicated science behind it. So it could be expanded down to lower grade levels in the future, but we started with secondary students in mind. MACAN gave us a list of resources that they had already collected, and we needed to sort through them to determine appropriate matches for the educational module and that were relevant to the Mid-Atlantic region. And we were really lucky to be able to involve all the educators throughout the summer and then get feedback from them. So after going through all of the resources, actually, Sarah, sorry, I think I moved the slides around. Could you like go forward one or two? I don't know if you don't have the updated one. Or maybe my changes didn't go through. Yes, if you could start there. Back one more. Yes, sorry. Okay, so sorry about that. So after going through all of the resources, and we did kind of our own additional research on what coastal acidification was, for the very first Tote workshop of the summer, which was just about 3 weeks in, we decided that we wanted to test out one activity that we knew we wanted to include in the module. So this was a New Jersey Sea Grant activity that uses Legos to explain the basics of ocean acidification chemistry. The chemistry of ocean acidification is a little bit complicated, and it involves the carbonate cycle, as you see here. So the way the Lego activity breaks down the ocean chemistry into understandable levels is really helpful. And we knew that this was an activity we wanted to include. So we shared it with the educators at the Virginia Tote, and we got some really good feedback from them. The teachers loved the activity and felt like it explained the relationship between the increased acidity of the water and then the unavailability of carbonate in the ocean really well. But they also really talked about how complicated the chemistry is in the first place and how it's not something that most of their students are necessarily going to have any background on. So we also got great feedback from the educators in general for what they knew about coastal acidification and what they wanted out of the module. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So most teachers we found were really unfamiliar with the term coastal acidification, and they didn't know the differences between ocean and coastal acidification. They also expressed the difficulty with the chemistry aspects and worried about explaining that to some of their students. And then they also emphasized their desire for activities that related coastal acidification to its biological impacts, as they felt that that could be most meaningful to the students. Okay, so now could you go back like 3 slides? Sorry about that. So based on the feedback from the Virginia teachers, we created a structured lesson plan, and we started with a 7-page guide for teachers that had foundational knowledge on the causes and effects of ocean and coastal acidification. We felt that it was really important that the teachers felt comfortable with what they're teaching, sharing with their students, and this guide really provides a good background on coastal acidification and some comparison with ocean acidification. It includes key terms and additional resources. So that the sections are all shown here. So we start with the carbon cycle, ocean chemistry and pH, nutrient pollution and eutrophication, the differences and similarities, biological impacts, and then key terms and additional resources. So it's broken down into sections so that teachers can just brush up on what they need or read the whole thing if they want to, but they'll have hopefully the background information they need all in one place to teach the module successfully. So then we organize the instructional contents of the module into 5 different sections. Could you go to the next slide, please? And so here are the 5 sections, and below them are the videos, activities, and demonstrations within each section. So it starts with a video that just really introduces ocean acidification. Then we talk about some of the chemistry basics, including the carbon cycle and CO2 emissions. And then we go a little bit deeper into the chemistry using actually 2 New Jersey Sea Grant activities, including that LEGO activity, and then talk about coastal acidification more specifically, and then finally talk about the biological impacts of coastal acidification. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one specific activity that we created. This was under the coastal acidification section. And so this is a data activity that we created to give students a chance to engage with more local data. So the activity starts with students looking at this Mid-Atlantic coastal chemistry infographic that describes some of the reasons for coastal acidification. So it's about 4 times as big as this small section that I'm showing you, and it gives really good examples of what's driving the changes to the Mid-Atlantic's coastal chemistry, as it's called. And so then they're going to look at a graph. Sarah, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. And this graph shows the pH of surface ocean waters. And then the students get asked some exploratory questions about why they might think the pH changes are occurring. So this shows seasonal changes in pH with distance from the shoreline on the bottom, and then pH on the y-axis. And so this is regional data. We worked with Grace Saba at Rutgers University to turn this published ocean glider data from 2018 and 2019 into the data dissection activity that I'm talking about. And so the thing that's really great about this activity is it's from the Mid-Atlantic region specifically, and it's pretty recent data. It's just within the past couple years. And so it is really easy to make the connections with the local connections. And it's real scientific data. So the teachers really liked the connections that the data made and some of the guided questions, but they felt that some sort of Easter egg in the activity, like a hidden surprise or a discovery point, would make the connections more meaningful. And that is some of the problem with finding a good data set for an activity, is sometimes the connections aren't as clear with coastal acidification because there are just so many drivers and impacts in the issue. And more work is needed to make this activity like truly classroom ready, but it's likely more appropriate for high schoolers than middle schoolers, but we still think there's a lot of potential with this data activity and then others in the future. We shared the entire module very similarly to how I just presented it to you, and then also the data dissection activity in depth with teachers at the New Jersey Tote towards the end of the summer. And then we asked the educators for some feedback. So they said they would really like more sample data sets like in the data activity, and particularly with that Easter egg that we just talked about. They mentioned some data sources that we could use to show pH changes in the ocean and coastal areas. And then they really talked about wanting a connection with the pH data and then biological impacts. So surf clams and oysters were given as potential examples of local organisms that we could talk about and connect that to the pH data. And there's ongoing research in these areas, but making the explicit connections is something that, maybe the researchers are still working on, but we need to work on making that clear for students as well. So some of the challenges of this module, I'm going to talk about a little bit. One of the biggest challenges was the knowledge of coastal acidification for the educators, as most had never heard the term before. So we hope that the teacher guide can really be a help with this problem and fill in the gaps that are needed. It was also particularly difficult to find activities related to biological impacts and data related to the Mid-Atlantic region specifically. There aren't many clear connections through biological impacts made in research yet, and it can be really complex to break down published work into a high schooler's level of understanding. And then just in general, the broad rather than specific connections between data and coastal acidification seem to be more difficult for students and educators to connect with. So if clear examples or connections could be found, that could be really beneficial to the module. So I mostly left the project at the end of this past summer, and so we left all of the Tote teachers with full access to the module as it was, and the teaching guide and then all of its contents, and gave them the opportunity to try the classroom or try the lessons and activities out in their own classrooms. And hopefully they would be able to try some things out and then let us know what they thought about it at a survey that we sent out later in the fall. And now I'm going to turn over to Sarah, and she's going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing since then.
Thanks, Greta. So now just remember that all of that just happened in summer of 2021. And I'm going to catch you all up on what's been happening since then and what our plans are into the future with this module. So it's still in development, still in progress. I wanted to talk about some challenges on my end. We did do a follow-up survey of Tote attendees, so I was going to share that data and then talk about our next steps as we move forward. So first, the challenges. Greta noted some of the challenges already, mostly that it was difficult to find ocean and coastal acidification resources that were Mid-Atlantic specific, which was the whole point of this module, which meant a lot more of creation of materials versus collating existing materials, which was fine, but that obviously will take a bit more time. So we're still working on that, and there are a couple people I know that are on the call that are working on similar efforts with teachers, and so we're still working to gather as many resources as we can to make sure that we are showcasing the current set of Mid-Atlantic resources on this topic. But there were a couple of other challenges that were kind of out of our control. First of all, our Tote workshop had to be held virtually last summer due to COVID, which of course limited the amount of testing and feedback that we could get from teachers. In addition, a lot of the resources that teachers do receive from our Tote workshops are typically taught at the end of the school year in the spring. Not all, but a lot of them. And since we're not there yet, we have a lower representation of teachers that have used these materials than I would think we will have at the end of the school year. So it just hasn't been very long, and they haven't had a chance. And of course, as you are all aware of, this is one of the most difficult years that teachers have ever faced. And so asking them to pilot test brand new resources on top of everything else that they're doing was difficult for them. And we had several teachers that noted they were out due to sickness for themselves or just overwhelmed. And so that was a limitation in the amount of field testing that happened with the curriculum. And lastly, you know, this was a great project. It was so fun to bring our summer interns to the table, but of course they were only here for the summer. And this project is continuing. So there was a bit of a disruption in our progress at the end of the summer, but it is ramping back up now, which is great to see. And our plan is to be ready for this summer for another round of pilot testing. So as Greta mentioned, we did do a follow-up survey of teachers that attended the Tote workshops in the summer of last year about their use of the module. Have you used it? What did you like? What is useful in your classroom? And this is a sampling of some of the information that we gathered. So For instance, as Greta mentioned, most of the teachers that we had at our Tote Workshops were secondary science, which means middle or high school. But on the survey results, most of the respondents were high school teachers. So that's important to know just for context. Most of them teach biology, life science, or environmental science. So again, you'll see no chemistry teachers are listed here, and that will be represented in the data that we see for what teachers would like to use in their classroom. And lastly, you can see that most of the teachers have not implemented the resources, but a good chunk, 44% have, which was nice to see. So we asked them of the parts of the module that you can see here, what has been most useful for you? And the percentages are the percent of teachers that found those resources to be helpful and appropriate in their classroom. So they did really appreciate the background information. And then the other three were pretty much equally important to them: the carbon cycle, the coastal acidification work, and the biological impacts. And you can see that the chemistry activity was not of interest to this very small sampling of teachers. But of course, if we were offering our Tote Workshop to chemistry teachers specifically, I feel like these results would be much different. We also asked teachers, what would you be interested in us adding to the module in the future? And this list was basically created by the MACAN Education Work Group, as here are some things that would be great to add to it. We had sent them the module at the end of the summer. They reviewed it, and these were ideas that they came up with. So sample data sets for students to analyze ranked the highest, and that falls in line very closely with what we see on our needs assessment of teachers in Virginia, that they do want locally relevant, authentic data sets that their students can practice their data interpretation and analyzing skills, and also their graphing skills. But equally as of interest to them were activities that relate to the biological impacts. They can't get enough of the biology. That's what they want to see. So we are working on that in our future additions to the module. How can we bring in impacts in the Mid-Atlantic region, biological impacts to coastal acidification? They did see some value in additional examples. So in specific species that were affected by coastal acidification. And then the last two categories, photos and videos of the gliders that are used to collect some of this data, and some pH data resources were ranked less importantly for these teachers. But again, this was a very small subset of teachers that responded to the survey. And again, if we did this later in the school year, I do think we would have different results. So that's kind of where we were probably at the beginning of 2022. We had sent out the survey to all the Tote teachers, and we just recently got this information back. And so now we're moving on to our next step, which thankfully we have some additional help. And Anna Caputo is a VIMS MA master's student that has joined our team and is adding to the curriculum, finalizing it, formatting it, doing all of those things, and working on adding those additional resources that the teachers responded that they would find helpful. So we are still moving forward, and the team includes not just Anna and myself, but also the education coordinators from New Jersey and Delaware. And we also have our education coordinator in Maryland who serves as a resource and another pilot testing site. So this is our plan as we're moving forward into the rest of this semester, basically. You can see that our end goal is this summer. So we're trying to have things wrapped up by summer 2022. And that's because our teachers on the estuary programs will be kicking off really starting in May through August, depending on the reserve location. And so at the beginning of this year, we're formatting the lessons to have a more cohesive look. We're reviewing all the feedback that I just shared, and we're looking for additional biological impacts, potentially with oysters or other species that we can add to the curriculum. After we get through that step, the next step is to do a little bit more testing and review. That will be more informal review. We're hoping to add a data activity and then have a set of educators, either NERRs, education coordinators, or other informal educators, to review the complete curriculum before it's shared with teachers again. And we also hope to share this at the MACAN spring meeting, education spring meeting, so that they can see the progress that has been made on the module so far. And then our ultimate goal is to offer this as a resource at our Mid-Atlantic Tote Workshops this summer. And like I said, they will start in May, and we might not be ready by May, but we're hoping to be ready by most of the Tote Workshops that happen in the summer. And those workshops are all may have different themes and different agendas, but what we plan to do is just offer this as a resource to the education coordinator. If they want to teach the entire module and go through each activity with their teachers, they can. If they want to offer it as an online resource that teachers can access additionally from what they've learned at their Tote Workshop, that's also fine. But no matter how it's offered to teachers, we really feel strongly that we need to survey teachers again. And this goes with any curriculum or resource for teachers. We don't want to assume that what we're putting out is helpful to them or useful in their classrooms. We want to make sure that it's appropriate and what they need. So we'll be surveying all the teachers from the 2021 tote again in the spring to see if they have used any of the resources at the completion of the school year. And then we'll also be surveying our 2022 tote teachers to see how they feel about the module as they're introduced to it this summer. So that is our plan for moving forward with the module. We have the bones of it, and we have some great feedback already, and now we just want to add to it and make it more complete. And so with that, we're going to move into more of an open discussion portion of the webinar. We're not going to be sharing any more slides, but I saw from the poll that we have a good representation of researchers on the call, which is wonderful, and also a good mix of state, federal employees, and informal educators. So we would love to get your feedback on the module, and I might pull that slide back up, the module as it exists right now, what you feel like is missing, or if there are resources that you know of. They could be data sets, they could be lesson plans, they could be anything that would be relevant to what these teachers might be interested in using in their classroom. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll be furiously scribbling down notes so that we can capture all of that. So I'm going to actually go back to the slide that lists the module that Greta showed. And if you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand, and we should be able to call on you, and you should be able to speak via your microphone. But if you feel more comfortable, you can type it in the chat or in the questions pod.
Yeah, so as Sarah mentioned, if you want to say something verbally, go ahead and raise your hand, and then on the back end here, we'll make it so that you can unmute yourself after Sarah calls on you.
I see a question or a hand up from Greg.
Hey, Sarah. So going back to your original polling when you were assessing the needs of the educators for these modules, did you find that their needs were more holes in their curriculum, or maybe like just something the individual didn't know about? So my thought is that can you consider like those filling or satisfying those needs kind of like to be a one and done, or is this something that may need to be renewed as, say, teachers retire and new teachers come into play?
Good question. I think it could be both. I know that Greta and Bethany did some research into the standards that the states in the Mid-Atlantic have to teach, and they definitely align with the standards that are required. I mean, there's nothing in the Virginia standards that calls out coastal acidification and you must teach about this. So I don't, in that regard, I think it's, interested teachers that are like, this is a great way to talk about human impacts on the environment, and they're just interested in using this as their example. So in my opinion, in terms of our teachers as they retire, there's always a need for more teachers, right, to be trained on particular curriculum, because there's always going to be that turnover. But I do think that the curriculum is probably seen more, and Greta, you also were there when we surveyed the teachers, but I would say it's probably seen more as a fun alternative to teach those standards than, oh, I've had this listed on my standards and I haven't known how to teach this. Do you think the same, Greta? Yeah. I mean, I find that with a lot of our NERS resources, they need to learn data graphing and data analysis skills. And so us providing an example that's in their backyard, they get more excited because it's more relevant to their students, and their students might become more engaged in that than an example that doesn't have any relevance to the students. So I think that's how we're kind of drawing these teachers in, is being able to show them this is something that's happening right here in your local environment. I hope that answered your question.
Yep, that's good. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Sarah, it looks like there's a question from Katie about how were the teachers identified to be part of the pilot?
To be part of our Tote Workshops? Let me read the question. So it depends. Each state is a little bit different. So for the Tote Workshops in Virginia, ours are just teachers can sign up that self-select. In other states, it can be something that's set up through their Department of Education. It could be a district-specific tote where the reserve has a partnership with a school district and they're offering their workshop that summer for that district. So for us, it just worked out that each of our reserves already are mandated to offer a tote workshop every summer. So we had this group of teachers that we could pilot test this with. And we'll have a whole different group this summer. So it'll be great to get their feedback and continue to add to it. But otherwise, we haven't offered it as something that teachers can opt in just randomly to review quite yet. But I think after this summer, our plan would be to offer it as an online resource that teachers could access, and then we could get more widespread feedback. And I see another question. Can you expand more on the biological impacts you plan to add for oysters? Will it include aragonite saturation states? Good question. I do not know the answer to the second part. I just know that, and actually she's on the call. I think she's still here. Yeah. So Dr. Emily Rives at VIMS has been working with some teachers last summer to create lesson plans based on ocean acidification. And so we have been, in contact with those teachers a little bit, and potentially might be a way to showcase that work that's being done at VIMS through a lesson plan. But Emily, if you would like to jump in and add about the aragonite saturation, that's part of your work or those lesson plans, feel free.
Sure. Our lesson plans are kind of divided into two categories, as they're both coming out of two different ocean acidification related projects. One is being developed alongside our community science initiative, where we're measuring carbonate chemistry and other parameters of water quality alongside oyster survival and growth at different shoreline sites in Virginia and Maryland. And the lesson plan in development related to that will include saturation state, in addition to other parameters of carbonate chemistry and water quality, in terms of helping students think about stress indices for oysters at these different places. And then the second lesson plan is being developed alongside a research project with American lobster. And that one will also introduce saturation state, but doesn't use it as explicitly in terms of the activity with the students as the oyster one. But we're looking forward to sharing those with you as soon as they're ready.
Thanks,
Thank
Emily.
you.
Yeah, we really see, you know, the MACAN, this module, really, its original intent was to be a collated set of resources, and it started with a huge list of existing resources that were out there, not all Mid-Atlantic, a lot from NERS and NOAA, not all though. And so it originally started with what's out there that we can pull together into a cohesive module that teachers could follow from start to finish and have a better understanding of ocean acidification. And then through that process, we realized a couple holes that we wanted to fill in with, like the data activity, and then potentially adding another data activity, or like the Easter egg activity where they're searching to solve some kind of mystery. But we really do see it as a collaboration of resources, but all in one place, so that teachers don't see this one activity. And now that we know they don't really have the background in coastal acidification or the understanding that that's different from ocean acidification, it would be great to have all of those things together so that they can build their understanding and then build their students' understanding through a series of activities. So we'd love to add any and all activities, and of course they're all getting credit to their respective authors, and when the curriculum is done, it will be listed as a collaboration between all of the people that contributed to the module. We're not seeing it as anything of ours, but just another resource for teachers. Any other questions? I don't see any hands up or questions in the chat, but if I'm missing something, let me know. And if someone thinks of a resource later that they would love to share, I would love to, I didn't even think to put my email address in this, but I'm going to put it in the chat right now. If anyone thinks of a resource or a data set that would be helpful for us to use, please feel free to share that, because we are still in that development phase. I see somebody has a hand up. Carrie.
Hey, Sarah and Greta. First, great presentation. This is really exciting, and love that there's going to be a Mid-Atlantic specific module available. Such a need for that. Without having a solid understanding of what the teachers need, I'm wondering if there's any opportunity of a resource being the career panel that Avalon mentioned in the beginning, that is being one of the webinars, and if there's any role MACAN might be able to play as a resource of what the students in the classroom could do with a career in ocean acidification, and if there's any way to help merge those two efforts.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome. I know at our last in-person Tote, which has been a while now, but we hosted a panel of people from VIMS that had a wide variety of careers. Because that is, at least in Virginia, has been a large focus for our 21st century graduate, is learning about different careers and the skills that they need for those careers. So I think that would be of super interest to teachers, and being able to share not just the research side of things, but the education side, the field crew side, like all of those different avenues that a student might take. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, we do record all of the webinars and make them available on the midacan.org website. I think it would be an excellent opportunity to maybe share that link to the recorded webinar. I also kind of want to put out a call for if there are ideas folks have on listservs that kind of reach the K through 12 educator audience, please do send them to info@midacan.org. I'll put that in the chat. That would be really great as we kind of build out many of these wonderful resources for that audience. It's important that we distribute it to the widest possible variety of people. So thank you.
Yeah, one of the one that jumps to my mind is the Scuttlebutt listserv, which is for marine science resources. So all the teachers that are on that list are already excited about teaching marine science, and I'm sure would love additional resources. I think I saw that Carl had a question about the Lego activity, and I'll let Greta explain that, but funny story, as she's getting her mic turned on, that actually got me a little bit in trouble at VIMS because I ordered Legos and they thought I was ordering like personal purchases being sent to the university because they saw them as toys. I had to justify that I was using them for educational purposes at the reserve. But Greta, do you want to explain what that lesson plan is about?
Yeah, so I thought the Lego activity was a really nice way to simplify the carbonate cycle and the acidification chemistry. But basically, you just use 3 colors of Legos. So you use 2 that you could use any color. We used yellow and blue, and then red. And red signifies the H+ ion, or the hydrogen ion, or whatever you want to call it, the acid, if you wanted to really simplify it. And so you basically play 3 rounds of this game at different years. So you would start like in the present day. And so you put a bunch of the Legos in a container that you can't see into it, like a bag or something. And then you only put in 2 red pieces to signify that there's not that much hydrogen in the ocean yet. And then you draw 2 Legos, and if it's a yellow and a blue, you can put them together because they're the parts of carbonate, so they fit together. And then if you draw a red and another color, then the red, can bond with one part of carbonate and not the other. So, but then basically you can't use those blocks to create structures. And so each time the yellow and the blue come together, then you can add them to whatever you're already building. But the red ones basically make it so you can't use those Legos anymore. So you just keep going, drawing 2 at a time, and you see how you can build. And then each round you add more red Legos to show the amount of acid in the ocean increasing. And just kind of go through each round, and it gets harder to build the structures because the acid makes it harder for the carbonate to form. And so then you can talk about how then animals have trouble building their shells and stuff like that. So it was kind of a cool way to break it down, and all the teachers were pretty excited about it, and none of them seemed to like chemistry. So they were all like, oh, where can I buy Legos and stuff like that. So it was a neat activity.
Yeah, they always like that one. It's a nice hands-on way to explain it to their students. Well, I am not seeing any questions or hands. I'm just going to check one more time. I'm not missing anything, right? Anybody else seeing? Okay. Well, we will give you some of your day back then and end a little bit early. But thank you again for joining, and we are looking to put this out in the summer. So please look for that resource, and we'll be sharing it with MACAN. And if anyone thinks of any additional resources between now and then, please share them with us. But thank you so much for attending.